Huh? What? 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 You sure? All right, folks. Thank you so much for coming to see this story humanitarian toolbox. I was going to do my 1977 gag again. Clicker. Hello, clicker. No clicker. Is this what I get? Yeah. Now it goes. This is my new clicker. This is what I get for using a new clicker. Did you? There. So I was going to do the 1977 gag again, but I realized there's a 1997 gag as well. One of the very first times I ever spoke outside of Canada was in 1997 in Arnhem at Papendal, when Papendal was really an Olympic center, because it's all kind of fancy now. But back then, it was dorms and pretty minimal. But yeah, it goes back a long, long way. Coming to the Netherlands and speaking has been a thing for me for a long time. In 1977, I was 10 years old. That's when I wrote my first line of code. I was an electronics kid. My father's an industrial engineer an electronics engineer. I actually learned to program cash registers before I ever laid hands on anything remotely resembling a computer. And in some ways, that old software development experience, that literally you write a line of code that runs, I mean, it was so empowering even for a 10-year-old just to be able to make the machine do something. You know, my first line of code was print, quote, hello world, close quote. My second line of code was go to 10. And then I learned what a break key was, because that thing will run forever. So, and I feel like we've gotten a long way away from that in modern software development. It's hard for new people to engage with something as complex as Studio, whether visual or RAD. You know, it's just a lot to look at. And you have blank screen syndrome. And the basic, you think about so much of our tooling today is built around how to get you to something that runs. You know, on the SPA side with the new Angular CLI or the JavaScript services, you know, all these different wizards and gizmos are really about, can I make an executing block of code or something that does something and then get into that edit cycle? It's just the complexity level, the bar is so much higher than it used to be. And I think it drives a lot of people off. It makes it very tough to get into. And it's tough to be, I think, as delighted, as enthusiastic as this kid is about software today. It is a much more contemplative, thoughtful, planned process that it's just not the same dynamic we've been used to in building software. And that's too bad, because we know it's really fun. You know, I try and convey that to folks who've never written code. It's just that moment of light. That when you get a piece, and when I think about the ritual, right? 10 print quote hello world close quote. That was a pretty good moment all by itself. Today, actually checking in a chunk of code that runs through the unit tests and gets past the basic gates and goes into the build process, you get that moment too, right? But it's a lot of stuff. And you know, typical experience for me after that 2 or 3 hours of banging away till you've actually written something that you're willing to check in, you know, now you want coffee, right? I tend to jump up and go, I am a god, and then I need coffee. And you go away and get your coffee, and probably when you come back, there's a nasty error message about a failed build. But, you know, this is the cycle we live in now. It's not as instantly gratifying. It's not certainly not as simple, because we do a lot more with software than they ever used to. And that, I think, it's hard to get excited about. An awful lot of development we do is just not that delightful. Forms over data is a good job. It pays the bills. It's better than doing real work, goodness knows. But that sort of moment of, am I changing the world today? Well, maybe for insurance. Okay, you know, that's something. But I've had the opportunity, I felt like I was never good working on one thing for very long, you know. My argument has always been, I harness my ADD for the forces of good. And the good news is there's so much software development to do that I just picked projects on it was places I hadn't been to before. So I've been to something like 93 countries now, mostly because other people paid me to go there to work on something. And a side effect of doing that, you do get a bit more of a world view about what development is like everywhere, how cultures are all different. I'm not surprised to see sandwiches and milk for lunch in the Netherlands. Like that, to me, that's totally normal. When that came out, I went, this is lunch in the Netherlands. I've done this for 20 years. This is what you, there wasn't much buttermilk. That's kind of odd, you know, but it's like, you want to know why Dutch people are so flippin' tall? This is the lunch. Right? There are not a lot of hamburgers not around there, and I even know what frikandel is, and I don't want to talk about it. So, and you may know my story well enough to know I got involved with podcasting, and so really just collecting and telling lots of people's stories around software. And when we were on tour, when Microsoft would actually pay us to take an RV and drive across the United States to talk about software, meet a lot of developers, they also asked us to do a charitable component. Like, how do you do something with charity around that? And I was very frustrated with how hard it was for software developers to donate their services to a charity, because software is not free. So even when you give it away, software is not free. Software is free the same way a puppy is free. You know, yeah, I can give it to you, but there's a price to pay. You know, it kind of needs care and feeding, and it sometimes makes a mess. And often we've seen situations, especially doing .NET Rocks things, where here was a group of people, nice group of people, working with a charity to build them a brochureware website. And they'd spend a long weekend drinking caffeinated colas and coding away. And at the end of the weekend, they'd have a little celebration, and they'd go back to their lives. And the charity's got this website now they have to live with. And they're sure there's more things to be done to it. And like we said, it's a puppy. It actually needs to live on from there. So I was looking at ideas on how we could do better and how we could think more broadly. And one of the aspects that I ran into fairly early on in charity was writing software for disaster response. So this is a shot after Katrina, which is a great, you know, I would argue they're still cleaning up from Katrina. That's 2006. Never really went away. If you look really close to this picture, you just see how much oil is on top of everything here. That all of the oil tanks in the ground, cars that are flooded, like the damage is, it's not just the water. There's a lot of pollution, a lot of damage there. And it was one of those times where that I really saw developers step up. 2006 is the beginning of the smartphone revolution. You know, the iPhone's just barely come out at this point. The cloud's not really a thing yet. And yet a lot of developers got together and helped in Katrina. They built software to facilitate finding people that were lost, finding pets that were lost. I met a guy who wrote a pet finder app. There's a lot of animals got abandoned, and they survive, and then you're just trying to match them up. And you can imagine a little dog soaked in oil, you know, who's managed to keep himself afloat for days. And finally, when the rescue workers come through on boats, they would grab these dogs and they take pictures of them with their smartphones, and the app would just post up the photos so people could identify, oh, that's my animal, and they matched them back up, which is cool. You know, an amazing piece of software. And the guy I was talking to, he's like, you know, you made some people's lives better that day. But at the end of the event, not that the event really ended, it was borrowed hardware, adrenaline-written software, and it gets lost. You know, this stuff just gets displaced, as it does. You know, we write a lot of things in a hurry, and they don't stay organized. And so what was interesting about the fellow I was talking to is he'd actually written that Pet Finder app 3 different times. He was getting fast at it, but at the next disaster, when they needed another one, he may or may not have working source code. He may or may not have the same hardware. He may or not remembered how it, you know, he'd just do it again. And so it's kind of repetitive. It's inefficient. You know, not a really strong way to write software. When I think about good quality software, and I come very much from an engineering mindset of this, I'm really focused on sustainability. Right? That concept of it doesn't have to be the fastest, it has to be sustainable, that we can continue to work on it, because any improvements we make will carry forward for forever. Most organizations, they're going to use software for years and years and years and years. And the need to locate lost pets is always going to be there in any given disaster. Why would we do this over? Why wouldn't we just get better at it and actually keep that software healthy for longer and do it as well as possible? And that drove me to this idea of open source. Now, I'm not a huge open source guy. I never was. I was never particularly emotional about this. Most code that I wrote, I never owned. It was always for someone else, and however they wanted to own it was fine with me. Some of them worked in the open source space, some of them didn't. To me, the code's not especially valuable. The ability to build it and operate it arguably is more valuable. I can't tell you how many times people have insisted on I give them a copy of the code, and in their mind, a copy of the code was a printout. That just, you know, speaks to how old I am. But it was like, we're wrapping up our contract with you, and we'd really like to make sure we have all the assets. Great. What do you mean when you say assets? Well, we'd like a copy of the code. And I loaded up dot matrix printer paper and printed out the code base from DBase and went, here you go. Enjoy. I'd be really interested to see what you ever do with that, but which is exactly nothing. Here are some 5¼ inch discs that have the code on it as well, but you probably don't know what to do with that either. You know, this idea of, oh, I had, you know, and how many times was I called in on a project where they said, well, we have a copy of the code, and they hand me a couple of disks. All right, what version of DBase was this? DBase? What's DBase? Okay, this is going to be a long day. But
they never give you the printed copy?
yes, how about a printed copy? Good, I'll do some typing. That's excellent. The open source movement has gone through lots of twists and turns. You know, and arguably, Sun Microsystems was one of the largest advocates in the early days, and the Java movement really drove this to another level. It was already open source before that, but when the tooling around so much, when Java was intended to be spread across multiple companies and so forth, this is where we got into really formal legal open source. And it's interesting to see that one of the lawyers that was the key guy behind writing those original open source agreements now works for Microsoft. You know, that's the world we're living in now. But when I think about open source more than anything, I think about is having a sustainable ecosystem outside of any given organization. So I'm not doing open source because I believe that data must be free. Like, I'm not that guy. In fact, I'm pretty much the opposite of that guy. I was doing hiring for a company many years ago, and I was in my 30s. And the kid I was interviewing must have been all of 22, and he had Googled me. And so he knew I'd done all kinds of things with Microsoft, and I made a podcast and so forth. And he literally railed at me during the interview about how data wanted to be free, and on and on and on. It's like, you know, don't oppress the system, it'll all be better. And I'm like, listen, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm going to wait till you're 30, married, mortgage, 2 kids. You'll kick your own ass. And then we hired him because he was really kind of good. A little ranty, but good. But I came to be, you've never met him. It's just great guy. We're all so much older that it's like, yeah, you're not going to get a rise out of me over those things, right? Licensing is licensing. Software ownership is important. It needs to be known, but there's no one right way. The one thing I've learned about writing software for 40 years, there is no methodology, no technology, and no philosophy that will stop you from screwing up, right? All apps can fail. All methodologies can fail. There is no certainty. I would argue the most important thing you do is diligence, right? Good communication, deep understanding of the problem, working with people you respect. You have a better chance of succeeding. And even then, it'll still go wrong, right? People's goodwill counts for more than just about anything else. Nothing, no piece of dogma will save you. So I like open source. And for this particular problem, as we were exploring it, it made a lot of sense. Right? If I'm going to have volunteers contributing source code, it should be in a structure that allows anybody to contribute anyway. That's why we went to open source for it. But I also want to talk about 3 more philosophical things that sort of drive this idea that open source touches against, but is almost an unintended consequence of. And I'm tapping into Daniel Pink's Drive, if you've ever read the book, where he really explores what is it that drives people to create or to make things, to do anything, really? What really drives us? Because economists will like to tell you that it's money. And while money is certainly a factor in the equation, it's a pretty limited one. And what Pink really gets into is this idea of when you're doing mechanical work, the amount you shovel or the row you hoe, the money equation makes, if I pay you more, you'll do more. But as soon as you're into any kind of thoughtful work, money becomes less and less effective. In fact, it can even become toxic. And one of the points that he makes is once money's sort of off the table, once your basic bills are paid, you're at your job and you do these things, your motivation really shifts. And it ends up being focused on 3 core concepts. The first is autonomy. So the ability to be self-directed, to work on things you want to work on, to work the way you want to work, to explore ideas how you want to explore them. And this is where I think volunteerism is so interesting, because what is a better definition of autonomy but choosing to work? And you see this in businesses all the time, where they're trying to find ways to provide people with more autonomy, not just developers, but basically say, here is the scope of the issues that we're dealing with. Please help us advance the cause one way or the other. And you have some choice into the pieces that you work on, how you work on it. Autonomy only comes up against certain limits, especially when you talk about open source. I got involved with the Postgres project very early on. The original, this is a database product built in open source, originally built by a bunch of disgruntled Oracle people, who then went off to build a better database. And there's lots that's great about Postgres. But in those early days, because it was very much this autonomous model, people working on what they wanted to work on, it had some incredibly powerful features, but was missing some fundamental ones. For example, and I'm talking 99, 2000, I was able to pass a table as a parameter into a user-defined function in Postgres, but I couldn't do incremental backup. Because when your development force is volunteer, passing table parameters is really, really cool, and you'll get that sort of stuff built. And incremental backup sucks. And even though it's important, it just didn't kind of get built, right? I mean, eventually the Postgres Foundation got together and they sort of leveled the playing field, and the Postgres is a fine, much more mature product than it is back then. Autonomy has its limits, but it is a very powerful force for getting work done. Another aspect of this is mastery, and I think it's one of the more ignored aspects because it's hard in some ways to quantify. One of the delights in the task that is software development is that nothing's ever finished and nothing's ever perfect. You can look at this in the form of music as well. There's never the perfectly played song. There's some very good versions, but there's always another way to tackle it, another way to solve the problem. There is a pleasure in pressing against the edges of your ability. How do you go further? And as I was working on putting together Humanitarian Toolbox, one of the opportunities we saw is this is a space where people can press on their mastery. Typically in our jobs, we don't. In fact, in many ways, our employer will discourage it. Don't do something you've never done before. Do something you know you can do, because the deadline's more important than the technology. Right? I want you to go with stuff you know so that we can get it out on time. This is a reasonable value proposition from a business perspective. But for us as individuals, for us as creators, not necessarily the best thing. And I think it's one of the reasons the whole open source movement exists. And Pink talks about this in his book. He says, there's kind of this madness. Let me get this straight. You're a software developer. You're going to write code 8 hours a day. That's your job. And when you go home from work, you're going to write more code for free. That's a little nutty. Like, why would you do that? And I think one of the big reasons is certainly autonomy. I want to work on the things I want to work on, but also mastery. I want to press against my skills. I want to be better. I think one of the biggest problems we have in software is this lack of deliberate practice, that we don't actually routinely press against our edges, independent of the work. Most of the time we do the work. Most of the time we write the code. Nothing wrong with writing code. Writing code is good. That's like the only way I learned to play an instrument is by playing songs. And what it actually takes to play an instrument is to do deliberate practice. And deliberate practice is, by its nature, unpleasant. It presses against the edges. It's doing scales. I had the good fortune of working closely with Carl Franklin for many years, making the podcast. I do not envy the man's guitar playing ability, because I've spent enough time with him to see how hard he works at it. I've also gotten to a place now where I've just stopped using the word talent. Talent bothers me, because talent seems like something that just came out of the sky and hit you in the head. Talent is an obligation. A skill is something you grow. My friend Carl is very skilled at playing the guitar. And he did it with a lot of deliberate practice. When we were driving around the countryside in that RV in 2012, every day he would pick up that acoustic guitar and he would do drills. He would play scales and he would play riffs for an hour. And then he'd play one song to reward himself and then put the guitar away. How often do we actually deliberately practice as software developers? It's relatively rare. The Euler techniques are a great example of where you could do deliberate practice. Take a known problem and then code it in a way you've never coded it before. So you're controlling some dimensions of the work. You know what you have to do. You know when you've got it right, but do it a different way. We did a show with Mark Seaman a while back where he said, try this. You like working in C#? Write a given function or a given service in C#, no if statements. That's a challenge, right? That's pressing against the edge of your ability. A different way to express a problem. No loops. It can be done, right? You got to think about it for a little while. That's interesting to me. When we talk about mastery, talk about thinking more broadly about how you do your craft. I think the polyglot movement as a whole, programming different languages, is exactly that same thing. You know how to solve that problem well in C#? Solve it in F#. Solve it in Erlang. Solve it in JavaScript, because deep down you hate yourself. Okay? Solve it in T-SQL, because you haven't written enough lines of code yet. Solve it in Perl, so that you can't explain it to anybody. You know, many choices. That, to me, is mastery. So autonomy, mastery, last but not least, purpose. And I think it's one of the reasons the open source movement exists as a whole. Often the software we're building for our day job is not particularly moving to us. We take our own delights in it, that it's great to make something, that it's great to be successful, it's great to have solved a problem, but there are bigger problems. There is more purpose, more meaning out there. Open source projects are great for this. You have a typical open source project is by developers for developers, right? It's a Jimmy Bogart, I'm sorry to pick on Jimmy here, but a great example of a guy who had a particular problem, built a tool to help him solve his problem, published it in a social way via GitHub, and other people are like, wow, I have that problem too, and they help contribute to his project. And it evolves into something bigger than any individual. Very purposeful when you're working within a community. And we have a community here, and we like to talk to each other, work on these problems and explore it, and so open source serves us well there. But in exploring stuff like disaster response, well, here's a pretty broad purpose. Can we use software to save lives? And we did it in Katrina. We've done it in other disasters, but could we actually do more? Could we do it in a more purposeful way, a more organized way, and take it further? And especially after Katrina, technology had evolved. The cloud's a real thing now. Yes, we know the cloud is other people's computers, but it's how I get to buy it that makes the difference, that I know where I can demand it close to where I need it to be, as much as I need to use, give it all back when I'm done. Provisioning time measured in seconds, not weeks, and an architecture that tolerates the fact that we can put in more and more and more and more for the time that we need it. Disaster response was made for the cloud. It's ideal for the cloud. Provision a ton for the period of immediate response, dial it back when that particular initiative is over or reduce. So that you're not provisioning, you're not buying gear for peak, you're not trying to move stuff around. You use what you need when you need it. I also think the mobile movement plays a huge role in this entire thing. The fact that we always have PCs on us now. And that combination of mobile and cloud lends itself massively to disaster response. And it's interesting to think that in a disaster, mobile and cloud still works. The cloud tends to not be in the disaster side. If it is, it's part of the disaster, but there's another cloud somewhere else, that's fine. The mobile part, well, the cellular network never fully works, but it never fully dies either. And most disaster responses, they're very quick to get cellular towers back up and running again. In fact, they have trucks with expanding masts on them and microwave relays, because especially in the early stages of a site response, any phone you can find still working out in the field probably has a person beside it that needs help. And so governments and organizations are highly motivated to be able to locate those phones before they run out of power. because they can help more people that way, save more lives that way. And when you have that network, suddenly that phone does a whole bunch of things. Now it's that on-the-scene camera, it's the ability to identify where you are, what you're doing. The host of capabilities are very broad. So this is Humanitarian Toolbox. Now in 2012, we lucked out because there happened to be a hurricane that year that hit the U.S. Super Hurricane Sandy. Now, as hurricanes go, it was a pretty sexy one. It hit a wealthy part of the world. It was well expected. There was plenty of damage, but not a lot of loss of life. Not going to say none. A country that geared up for it and moved a lot of things in. We had to literally change the track of our road trip. We had to avoid that area entirely, which was fine. We were headed south when all of the relief workers were headed north. And they descended on Sandy en masse and did their best to help out. Now, one of the things that's happened over the years of disaster response is that social media has created a circumstance where there are many, many more organizations that can raise money in a disaster. Right? That ability to immediately be able to help, just click here and there's your $5 you can help, has meant that on a disaster site as massive as a hurricane, instead of a half a dozen big government organizations descending, now it's literally hundreds of organizations with thousands of volunteers. And so organizing them is hard. Their effectiveness is limited just because it's so fragmented. And so the need for software has never been bigger. Now, I know my way around software. I've been doing software for decades. What I didn't know an awful lot about was charities and much less disaster response. So as we got drawn into this, I started getting an education. And one of the first things I learned from effective relief workers was this concept of outcomes, not outputs. The goal was to save lives, not to run code. Talking to disaster relief workers about using their smartphone, their reactions were typically, will this thing beat pen and paper? Because the battery life on paper is pretty good. Right? They think through the problem. The bar is very, very high. They think about outcomes. Right? That is their motivation. And then we could talk about an obvious charity group, that Doctors Without Borders. These guys have been around for many, many years. They originally started out of France, but they're everywhere in the world today. And they are extremely well organized. They come into a disaster site with a portable hospital and all of the equipment, crew, software, everything they need to operate on it. And that's awesome. They are phenomenal at that particular role. But if you talk about a major disaster site like a hurricane, while there's a need for a hospital, there's also a need for medical workers that travel in teams, right? These synthetic teams, this is an example of one, an exploration team. So you have folks that know structural engineering. You have folks that have medical skills. You have folks that are, this is actually a team from the typhoon in the Philippines. So you have local folks that know, that can figure out what neighborhood they're actually in with everything destroyed, right? And speak the local language and know the rules of the customs and so on. Often you have specialists in engineering, just being able to swamp, to be able to move heavy equipment around. It's a complex team. No single organization has all those different skills in it. Sometimes government orgs like FEMA do, but most of the time, especially when descending on a developing nation site, they'll come in different groups, and they need to be organized. Here's an example. This is actually the Fukushima organizational panel where they're bringing or organized different teams. That's why it's all in Japanese. But I thought it was a great example. I've seen other pictures like this from Haiti and from other disaster sites. They're just sorting paper constantly. The coordinators are trying to figure out who have we got on the site, what skills do they have, how can they help, how do we organize them in the units that we can actually do some work for. And this thing to me is just begging for software. So we started working with an organization called Envoad a number of years ago to build a project called Crisis Check-In. So this is something that runs on the phone. These volunteers are experts, but they are volunteer. So they preload the app on their phone and they put in their info, what they're skilled at, who the organization they work with, and so forth. And then as they come onto a site, they're able to register with the service, and that provides their data automatically. This is one of the screens from just some tests where we're doing volunteer check-ins. So we have these concepts of clusters, different volunteers, and they have, the main thing we're keeping track of is when they're coming on the site, when they plan to go off the site, although often exiting a site is much harder than you think. And while they're there, we're able to know what their skills are, roughly where they're located. We can also, they can add additional information. So we were working with a group in Haiti that battled this particular problem. Our software wasn't ready, I wish it was. But as they were exploring the countryside of Haiti, largely disconnected, they'd find caches of supplies and equipment. They'd take pictures of them and note where they were. But if you just try and write that down, it's pretty hard to coordinate. It's easier that they got that loaded on the phone, and as they got back into bandwidth, that data was loaded up. And so we could build a map of what was found. This well is still working. That structure is still sound if we want to clean it out and use it. That kind of information. It was faster to coordinate with us. So this app's been underway for a couple of years now. We have done a couple of field trials with it. Real disaster response software goes through very high gates of quality. Typically what will happen is that FEMA will put together 2 or 3 times a year an initiative to basically do a demonstration disaster. So they'll simulate an earthquake in Los Angeles, and they're testing many different things: response cycles, equipment, communications, and sometimes new software. And so if you're in a proper place and you've done the paperwork, you'll get a few people that will take your software out for a spin, and you'll get feedback from it. Now, it's frustrating for me as an agile developer to only get feedback a few times a year from field trials, but you work with folks that like your software will continue to work with you and make suggestions. So we do iterate with the teams pretty closely. We build them out as work items in GitHub, and they're just sitting as issues, and so anybody can pick them up and contribute to them. The other thing about being open source that way is if somebody else wants to use our software, go for it. I can't stop you, nor do I want to. Right? I like when we work in the open like this, anybody can contribute, anybody can utilize it. Somebody comes up with a better idea and wants to run in a different direction, knock yourself out, right? I'm not interested in protecting code. It makes no difference to me whatsoever. What I'm really concerned about is not writing the Pet Finder app ever again. That there is one that anybody can use that has a good build process and you can take it over. And the same thing with the check-in service. We're gradually building this up with different capabilities so you can contribute to it. We typically do that. We get our contributions through Codeathon. So we'll run an event on a weekend, couple of days, try and have an expert or two available, either remotely or locally. I've never found more than 20, maybe 30 people at the most can really be productive in this model. We hope to get them on a call or something in advance so that they can learn a bit more about the different projects and can get engaged and sort of know what the build process is, especially if you've never worked on open source before. It's fairly challenging to get started on something like that. And then come the weekend, you're with a group of people that are all trying to make a contribution. You pick up the work items you like and you write some code. We really strive for everybody gets a check-in that weekend, and preferably ultimately to a pull request. And we've also learned that while those contributions are valuable, out of any given group of people, 1 or 2 of them will really get hooked on the project and they'll keep contributing. If you look at our projects on GitHub, you'll see there's not a messiah type. There's not one person that wrote the bulk of the code and everybody else is contributing on the sides of that core base. It's a dozen people who've all gotten hooked on this project that have made hundreds of contributions. There's lots and lots. There's hundreds of contributors that have done 2 or 3 or 4, and we're grateful for the contribution. But once this becomes a hobby, I had a group of guys come in an event we did in Wisconsin, 3 of them. They used to go bowling on Wednesdays. And then after spending the weekend with us, you know what we could do on Wednesdays? We could drink beer, wear our normal shoes, and write code. And to this day, every Wednesday, you see a couple of check-ins from these guys. They're still picking up work items and continuing to contribute. Let's talk about another project. This is sort of, in some ways, our marquee project. We have a contributor sitting in the room, actually. So already was a project we got from the idea from the Red Cross. And it's much more of a preventative project. Speaking very broadly about already, we'd say this is about organizing volunteers in an efficient way so that their particular skills can be applied to where they're needed. Now let's talk about a specific case, and this is the one we've tested this app with. In the United States, the Red Cross has initiatives to put smoke detectors into homes that don't have them. And so what they'll do is they'll set up a little stand at a Home Depot or a home improvement center, saying, do you need a smoke detector? Because we'll put one in for you for free. Smoke detectors are cheap. The main issue with smoke detectors is knowing where to install it in the house. It's actually a thing to do properly. You need qualifications to do that. Typically, volunteer firefighters, home construction folks, they do the certifications. They know where to install the smoke detector. And they're willing to volunteer a day to install smoke detectors. Now, that's our constraining resource. As a volunteer organization like the Red Cross, it's like we've got only so many skilled installers, only so many days they're going to do installation. So let's make sure we use them as efficiently as possible. So we use other groups of volunteers to run those stands to get names and addresses of folks who need smoke detectors. And then after we've compiled enough of them, that we can sort them out into geographical groups close to our volunteer, then we can send that volunteer a list of names and addresses and a half a dozen smoke detectors and have them use their volunteer day to get as many smoke detectors installed as possible. And in our trials of this, before they were using the software, what they found was it would take them 3 to 4 months to do a campaign to get enough names to make it worthwhile to send out the volunteers. Volunteers would typically get 5 or 6 smoke detectors, and they'd get 2 of them installed in a day. Because if that much time goes by, they may or may not answer the door, they may or may not be there, so there's a relatively low yield. Now, we're all software people in this room, so right away you've got your head going. We can do this better with the cloud and mobile devices, right? We can gather the data faster. We can actually do direct collection for people that are on Facebook. Can we get you a smoke detector? As well as on the on-site stuff, which definitely works, but map it faster. Use a mobile app so that we can feed it to the volunteer faster, so that we can get them out in less time. More names in less time, utilizing the volunteers more effectively. And then simple things like we added Twilio to the app so that when the installer is ready to go to a home, they can hit a button and we're auto-dialing that home and saying, hey, your installer's coming over, their name is this, they'll be there in the hour, you know, just the same way the cable guys won't. The app doesn't look all that different, really. I mean, a bit of mapping software going on here. This is a campaign screen. So they were doing the Queen Anne Fire Prevention Day, and they have the dates set on it. So this is actually the software side of helping the volunteers coordinate to do the name collection. And then on the back end, you have these installations. And those tricks, when we field trialed this, we went from 2 installs out of 6 to 5 installs out of 6. So the yield went up. The volunteers feel better, and hey, we're actually saving some lives along the way. Nice thing with it having all automated now is we actually have the addresses of all the places where smoke detectors are installed that we help to install. And so if and when, let's cross our fingers that it never happens, they do actually have fire calls, we can show this is a smoke detector that made a difference, right? Without a smoke detector, people are more likely to die, property is more significantly damaged. Smoke detectors make a difference. They save lives, without a doubt. If we can put more of them in the homes that need them, let's do it. But I hope you can think about this project in a way that there's many things that we could do here. This would be great for, hey, we're in the Netherlands. Flood evaluations, right? Can I send an expert around to tell you what you could do to your home to tolerate a certain class of flood? I have volunteers who are willing to do it. Same problem, just collect the names, get the volunteers out where they need to be. There's a host, what I like about this project is a ton of different things we could do with this. So I'm now talking, well, I've got the Red Cross using it already, and different branches of the Red Cross is a big organization. We've actually talked to the Dutch Red Cross about it as well. There are many charities that can use this software. So we're doing our best to greenfield, to whitelist this app, turn it into a form where we could put different names on it, use it in different ways. And along the way, Microsoft came up with Microsoft Philanthropies. And that's basically public cloud for public good. Love it. We're one of their poster children now. Because we're basically a charity born in the cloud in the first place. So and the Microsoft guys looked at us and said, hey, how much cloud would you like? Because we don't, you know, what's expensive for Microsoft with cloud, they've already paid for all the data centers and stuff. Like that's a sunk cost. What's expensive for Microsoft is tech support. So while they have every intention to give as much cloud as they can to different charities, they're also committing to a massive amount of tech support to get these people up to speed and actually use it well. We really don't need help. We kind of know what we're doing on that side. Like we're faking it on the charity and disaster response side, but the software side, we got nailed. So as Microsoft Philanthropy came along, I was able to go to the Red Cross and say, could we just run this for you? Would that be okay? And they're like, yeah. Because provisioning through their IT, I mean, that's a constrained resource inside of the Red Cross. It's a very big organization, but their IT is mostly internal. To run external-facing apps is a whole other set of problems for them. We have experience with that, and all the Azure we can eat just makes life simpler. Of course, they immediately went into this, can we use our identity? So boom, we're in Azure AD and working with Identity Server. I mean, one of the fun things with me involved in this is, well, I'm a mediocre coder. I know everybody. So when we realized we had an identity problem, I just called Dominic Beyer, the guy who wrote Identity Server at Brock Allen, and said, could you guys help us with this? They're like, yeah, sure. Good cause, great idea. they showed up in the Slack channel and worked with the guys to get them up to speed and get them moving ahead. And we had a time zone problem. The guys were looking at Nota time. Have you heard of Nota time? This is John Skeet's library for actually managing time zones. And as soon as you understand that time zones are political and not mathematical, right, which is why, you know, Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh all share roughly the same hour time zone, just some are on the half hour, some are on the 45. And in that entire span, China's in one time zone across that whole thing. Time zones are hard. And so as we're trying to build up the software to do time zone properly, they want to use Nota time. Nota time is complicated because time zones are complicated. I ping Skeet. Would you mind helping these guys? Oh, sure, no problem. He shows up, spends an hour with them, and they're like, was that John Skeet? Yeah, that was John Skeet of Stack Overflow Flame. So they had a great time. John had a good time because he was talking to regular developers trying to use his library so he could make his library better. So, you know, I feel like I'm my best self when I'm connecting all these different groups of people together to try and write this software. And it'll, you know, I feel like we're so past the puppy problem. We're building sustainable software that multiple, it's not like 150 contributors to this project, right? And more coming on all the time. There's a list of work items sitting there. You can pick them up and contribute to them. We ran testing contests. I got involved with the Star East and Star West conferences. That's great big testing conferences where QA people get together to talk about how dumb devs are. And they would run contests to see who could pump the most tests in an hour. They'd use our software. You know, 3 days of that, we got 800 bugs. Some of them are pretty daft, right? But many of them are good. They're insightful, right? Real testers beat the snot out of our software to win an Xbox. And those could turn into issues. And if you want to knock a bunch of those out, more power to you. Like, that helps me make my software better, you know, move these things further along.
Do you have like a centralized GitHub organization?
Yeah. No, it's GitHub slash HTBox. This particular project's already. So Brady was on the Microsoft team. The original version of Already, I don't even know if we had this logo at this point, was actually a sample app for Visual Studio 2015. And so they did a video series and so forth. They did the initial prototype work with Jim McGowan, who was the Red Cross person that was sort of driving this forward and still is to this day. And then after that was over, we took the code over and fixed it because, you know, Microsoft people. And grew it up. Well, the demands got way larger. As you actually start putting this stuff in the field, like each time we would do a field trial with the Red Cross, they'd involve a large, and it's the best thing you can, you know, they kick our ass every time, right? I mean, that's software. First time you put it in front of the customer, they're just going to brutalize you. They brutalized us. But the next time we fixed it, the next time they showed it to a larger group of Red Cross people on a bigger initiative, and they kick our butts again. And we got a little better and a little better. My best gauge that we were doing well is they were willing to show it to new people in a larger group each time, so that we gradually were able to reach out and work across multiple states with the app.
See, you're leaving out one of the most important details of how that whole thing came to be.
Which is what?
It's right at the end of the GS 2015 shit, the track before build.
Yep.
He just swoops in the rope and, hey, let's take a week off and work on it.
Yeah. That's what I do. I've even shown up to the MVP Summit. We did a weekend after the MVP Summit, those things. But I run all over the place just telling the story and showing it off. I put together a slide of contributors to Already. Just, you know, it's a lot of people. And from a really diverse group. This is a picture from this past London. It's a good story. The fellow on the right, his name is Steve Gordon. Steve Gordon was one of the very earliest contributors to Already. He heard about it on .NET Rocks at a time when we were only really doing stuff in the US. We started getting these check-ins from the UK. Steve Gordon, like, hey, cool, we got a contributor from the UK. And Already has a Google Hangout every other week on a Saturday evening here, Saturday morning back on the West Coast. In North America, and so he started showing up to that as well. And, you know, a good contributor, a regular contributor. Love it. When the Norwegian Developers Conference was coming to London, which means it wasn't really all that Norwegian, that's why they just call it NDC. So NDC London asked me if I would talk about HTBox. I said, well, why don't we do a codathon while we're there? This is this past January. So we were setting up a 2-day codathon. Steve contacts me. He's like, oh my God, I'd love to meet you guys in person. I really want to be at the Codathon. You know, what do we got to do? I'm like, dude, it's free. You come on, just come on up. And he pings me back a week or so later and says, I can't go. I wanted to take vacation days, but we're in the middle of a deadline, so I'm not going to be able to come up. I'm like, well, that really sucks. You know, this is good stuff, right? This is good corporate citizenship. You really should have your team involved. Like, there's a lot to be done here. And I sort of gave him some ideas of how to talk about this. And we went back and forth a few times. And finally I said, like, would you like me to talk to the CTO? He's like, would you do that? Yeah, I would do that. So I got on the phone with the CTO, and about a half an hour later, his whole team's going, paid for by the company, as a team building exercise. And he's like, how do you do that? It's like, have you met me? This is what I do for a living. I'm very persuasive. But that was, you know, the point I made. Like, I didn't deceive this guy. I actually talked to the CTO. And what did I learn? What are you struggling with right now? He's struggling with hiring, right? He's got good projects. They have more software they need to build. It's like, let me talk to you about how you build a culture that builds great software, right? It is about providing autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Right? Now take on those three problems. You take on those three problems in the form of an initiative of corporate citizenship. Let us give to a meaningful cause. Let us do it in a way that gives our people an ability to exercise their skills, to challenge themselves, and to build a stronger team in the process. And when he saw that, he's like, yeah, this is what we do. And in fact, that company, so in this picture, I think 5 or 6 of them, most of the front row here actually, are all from Magix, from the same company that Steve works for. And they now do a quarterly Codathon on Humanitarian Toolbox. And as I've checked in with the CTO since then, that is a great recruiting exercise. They work for a purpose, challenging themselves and building a better team in the process, and it becomes a place you want to work. And so Steve got a promotion out of that deal too, which more power to him, because he's not your aggressor guy, right? This is not a Brady Gaster. This is a soft-spoken, backroom guy, all these things that Brady is not, but who writes good code. And when given an opportunity to shine, he did. And came with a purpose, came with some meaning, and ended up building a great team and has made a great contribution to the project. And many of these guys can continue to contribute. So it opens a door. It opens a door to a bunch of initiatives on what you can do inside of your organization and how you can take that superpower you have to build software and do more with it. It's not hugely complicated. The software we're building is not immensely difficult. It operates in more stringent conditions than most. It has a high bar for what you need to get over, so it takes time to build, but we're patient. This is about sustainable software. We take feedback and we get better. My long-term vision about what we're building here has got more to do with how we know we're getting better over time. I want to be able to measure from one disaster to another. Are we on the ground sooner? Do we save more lives? Do we understand the full scope of the damage quickly? Can we start restoring homes? How long before people are back to their regular lives? And the only way we do that is by measuring it. This is about building up a set of tools that's going to take years to do so that we can take that software and be able to use it to measure event to event. We're actually getting better at this. I don't like adrenaline-driven software. It's incredibly compelling, and we get calls every time there's a major disaster saying, how do I contribute right now? And I will tell you right at that point, put it to the Red Cross, put it to Doctors Without Borders. Those people need your money at this moment on the ground. We don't go on the ground at a disaster site. We're working in between disasters to steadily get better so that when our software's in the field, it's ready to go and continue to improve. And we'd love it if you were part of that and your company was a part of it. There's so many more things to build. One of the things that's happening now is we've had some success is that there are other projects out there that need homes. So we're being approached by charitable organizations and other development groups that have built software to a certain point and they can't manage it anymore. And so they're looking to, can you sustain this with us? And we'll help take it on. We have the Microsoft Philanthropies aspects. We can actually do operations in certain cases. But it's not just about writing greenfield, right? I didn't actually, my goal here is not to write software, it's to be more effective in disasters. So we've now been approached by folks that have remarkable pieces of software that they've been internal to a given charity, and that charity's hit against the limits of what they can do. But if we could lift the software out of there, let them continue to use it, and then make it available to more people. So there's some big brownfield projects coming down the path soon, and not necessarily in the Microsoft stack either. Already has been very much built on .NET Core, ASP.NET. Crisis Check-In has been a Cordova mobile app so far, although there's some pressure to move to Xamarin as well. One of the projects I'm looking at right now is lightweight software for hospital administration in developing countries. So being able to administer a hospital from an iPad with an irregular internet connection. Very cool project. Already running in the field in a dozen small hospitals around the world. They want many more written in Ember.js. So that's its own set of problems. But they are willing to open source it. We're working with the JavaScript Foundation to take that on. That should be a project you can contribute to in the next few months. So again, want to explore some different aspects of skills? This is another app we're putting into play. And there's several more like that. So there's a lot that we can work on here. We still are early days. It's only been a few years that we've been doing this. But we are getting better at it, and there's a lot more that we can contribute to it. It's going to be bigger. And with that, I'll yield the rest of my time. Sir.
How do you get through situations like with the hospital and various hospitals, probably more jurisdictions and countries that have a lot of regulations around how stuff works, how it's secure, blah, blah, blah.
We are not going to get around that, right? I mean, that's sort of the reality. PII is PII, even in Tanzania or Kenya, right? And so ultimately that data has to be stored on site. We have to find a way to do that. I think we can architect hospital run, which is this particular project, better so that it can do that. I think we can get it in containers and things, so it could run on a clunky old machine under a desk if it had to. Or it could be run in the cloud in something that is acceptable, like the EU has good PII around what Azure can do. So now Azure as an architecture means we could put Azure Stack into a developing country for a few $1,000s in a small ISP and its same architecture. So I think there's choices there.
I was thinking if somebody comes along and they build some software and it's done enough and now you can't deploy it because of regulation.
Well, and maybe we don't deploy it, but they can deploy it because they're local to that country, right? And again, I'm not emotional about these things. I have no need to operate this stuff if we don't have to. I'm whatever say, has the biggest impact one way or the other.
Right.
But my experience working with these charities so far is you talk to the people on the ground who are local and know the rules and do what they say. So, but it's absolutely a challenge. And we're certainly going to run into that with any of our projects. In the end, every time you collect names and addresses.
I'm thinking of a fork of this where you handle like green industry, people that go out and assess your home. And
Yeah.
they can just all do it.
They absolutely could. And I'm not going to be the least bit surprised, we've already talked about it, that some of this software is going to end up going off in commercial branches. I use MIT licenses for a while, for a reason. I don't actually want to have the license impair anyone. If that means somebody figures out how to make money off the back of the software, more power to them. Maybe they'll contribute back, right? I like the karma of open source, especially these days. I think we're a little less angry. I like the community that's growing up around HTBox projects because there isn't really a dictator for life in our projects. So we're less dependent on a given personality, more on a collective personality. And the collective personality of someone who takes on a disaster response project, they're pretty nice people. This is a terribly nice group of people to work with. Like, I'm almost embarrassed. I only play a nice guy on a podcast, and here I work with a whole bunch of real nice guys. So that, they contribute a lot of time to this. And if you want to get more involved, my Twitter handle, HTBox's Twitter handle, the website, we've got a registration point where we'll send you some information. You can go on GitHub. The projects are all there. If you've never spent any time in open source before, we can help you with that. It's not hard. It's fairly easy to get a build going and be able to make a contribution. There are lots of jump-in issue work items. So again, if you're new, they're easy. It's one of those things that Star West is good for is 800 spelling mistakes, right? So go correct some spelling mistakes for us. Get yourself in the cycle. We haven't done multilingual yet. Already is definitely on the radar for the multilingual issue, but we'll, one thing at a time. That's definitely being planned in, and as well as different operating distributions, different security requirements. So we have a need. There's another project we're looking at, we may be taking on, that one of their first needs is going multilingual because they're mostly working in Western Africa, and so French is huge as well. So yeah, there's so much good software to build, my friend. I'm not complaining. We have excellent problems, but they are still problems, and they're very broad. All right, get some coffee. Thank you so much for your time.